when the women were ferrying fighters, it got really hot in the summertime in those cockpits. And you're not supposed to open the hatch, but this one a classmate of mine, got so hot in her P-51 that she decided she would take off her shirt and catch a few rays and cool off at the same time. So she took off her shirt because she was way up at, I don't know, 10,000 feet, and nobody around her thought she was safe. And she still was hot. And so she thought, well, I'll just crack the hatch just a little bit. And she knew she wasn't supposed to do that because things fly out when you do that. But she wasn't thinking, and she was hot and wanted some relief, so she cracked open the hatch and whoosh, out went the shirt. This happened more than once, believe it or not. Anyway, she thought, well, I've got a clean shirt in my briefcase underneath my feet. Before I land, I can put that on. I'll just stay like this now, at least cool off a little bit. So she was flying along straight and level, and all of a sudden she had the feeling that somebody was looking at her. And she looked around and looked over her shoulder, and there was another P-51. No, it wasn't a P-51, it was a Navy plane with the pilot just grinning. She said he was so close that his propeller was almost chewing a hole in her wing. And she said she could count his freckles, he was so close. Anyway, he grinned and smirked and finally peeled off and left her. But she always wondered what kind of stories he took back about naked women pilots.
They knocked down 3 planes.
8 missions you were lucky, 10 somebody up there liked you, 25 was almost an impossibility.
The plane blew up and I got knocked out.
Welcome to Air Combat Journal. Today's journal entry is from World War II WASP pilot Marion Hodgson. This is your pilot, John Thurman, asking you to sit tight and strap in. Air Combat Journal is ready for takeoff. Who and what are the WASPs?
WASP stands for Women Air Force, all one word, Service Pilots. Women Air Force Service Pilots. And there were 2 women that were instrumental in getting women pilots in service. One was Nancy Love, who had got about 25 women pilots together who had hundreds of hours of training at their own expense. They were not Army Air Force trained. And they were ferrying very light equipment for the Air Force, for the Ferry Command. And then Jacqueline Cochran came along with more ambitious ideas for women and thought that we should be trained and learn to handle any fighter or bomber that the Air Force had. So Jacqueline Cochran really won out and became the head knocker. And Nancy Love was head of the Ferry Command girls, but it was an umbrella with Cochran at the top. And she went through General Arnold, and they got the program together so that we would be trained the same way the men were, except we did not have gunnery training. And so she was the head right up until the end.
Marion's initial introduction to aviation, a not-so-great experience.
Well, to go way back to when I was about 5 years old, there was a Ford tri-motor airplane that came to town, barnstorming, meaning they landed in a field and would take passengers up for $1 a piece, I think it was, and fly them over town and land back in the pasture. And my family, that consisted of mother, father, brother, and sister, and I were all going to give $1 a piece and fly around town on this tri-motor Ford. And we got on board the plane and they started up the engines, and it was so loud, so noisy, that you just can't even imagine how loud they were, that I started screaming and said, "Let me out of here, let me off, let me off." So they had to taxi around and go. I made so much noise and created such a disturbance, they had to taxi back and let me off the airplane. And I can remember my mother saying, "Marion, if your mother and father and brother and sister are all killed, don't you want to go with us?" And I said, "No!" So I can remember watching that plane take off and wondering if my mother and father and brother and sister were going to be killed, and then I would be an orphan, whether I should have gone with them and died with them. Of course, I was convinced whoever was on the plane was going to die. So that planted the seed of shame inside me, and I think maybe what spurred me on to fly was that I was trying to overcome this horrible character deficiency that I had. But it took a while, and it was when I was a senior in college that we were offered a civilian pilot training course called CPTP. And it was free, and you got a private license and 5 hours college credit for going to ground school. So that was too good an opportunity to turn down, and I was still trying to overcome my shame at having disgraced myself when I was 5. So I took the course and got my private license, and it turns out that's what WASPs had to have when it was all said and done. You had to have at least a private license to be eligible for the WASP. That didn't count as our training. They started us as if we had never flown before. But that was just a requirement, I guess, just to weed out those of us who might get airsick or weren't serious about it or whatever.
Marion's first airplane ride.
Before I got into the flight school, my very first flight was with a boyfriend who was a medical student. And he had, I think, $2 or $3, just enough to take me up for a quick ride. And he kept pretending that the engine was quitting. Of course, he would just throttle back and it would cough and sputter. And he'd say, "Find a field, quick, find a field." And I'd be looking around. I couldn't see any place that we could land, just absolutely terrified. And he did that several times before I finally figured out he was making the engine quit. So I pummeled him good when we got down on the ground. But that was my first flight, and I was absolutely terrified. I can remember hanging on to the wires to the support, or whatever you call it, feeling like I had to hold the plane up myself. So it wasn't off to a very good start.
Mastering the machine, Marion finally experiences the joy of flight.
When the war came along, that's of course why I went into the WASP, because I could contribute something to the war, like Rosie the Riveter was doing her job. And I was scared to death when I started flying, and was scared a lot of the time while I was flying. But once you sort of got, I guess I was in basic training. We had primary, basic, and advanced. And when I was in basic training in the Volti vibrator, as we called it, BT-13 or BT-15, I suddenly realized that I could control the thing. And that was a very exhilarating feeling, because the airplane had been flying me up to that point, and now all of a sudden I was flying it. And then when I got to the AT-6, it suddenly turned into sheer joy. That was a beautiful airplane to fly, and I loved it. So fear was, they say, a pilot's life is 90% boredom and 10% abject terror. So there was always that 10% of fright in there, but 90% of satisfaction and enjoyment too.
Getting parental consent to go to flying school.
Well, my father had died recently, and so all the responsibility was on my mother. And when I first had to get her permission to fly for CPTP course in college, I was under 21, I was just 19. And she had to give written permission. And she cried and said, "I feel like I'm signing your death warrant," but she did sign. And I lived through that, and then by the time I went in the WASP, I was 21. Didn't need her signature anymore, but of course I tried to get her approval, and I did get her reluctant approval. But she was convinced I was going to be killed, and she was giving up her daughter for the cause. But anyway, I surprised her and came back.
Marion's mother's and grandmother's pride in her WASP service.
Mother was very proud of what I was doing, even when she was scared to death and was sure I was going to be killed. She was still proud of me. And my grandmother was my greatest booster, but she always, from the beginning, had been in favor of my doing whatever was exciting and an adventure. And she would tell people when I was in the ferry command that I was ferrying bombers to England. And I would say, "Granny, I haven't been near a bomber, and we're not allowed out of the United States. Please stop telling people that. We do not ferry bombers to England." She'd say, "Oh dear, I know, you've corrected me before. I'll get it straight. I'm sorry, excuse me." And the next time she'd be at a party, she'd be over in the corner saying, "And Marion's flying bombers to England." I never could get that idea out of her head. And even today, people, even Chuck Yeager in his book, and he was Jacqueline Cochran's best friend, said that we ferried bombers to England, and we didn't.
No overseas ferry flights for the WASPs.
two women, Nancy Love, who had started the original WASPs, and I forget who the co-pilot was, were in a B-17. They were in Newfoundland and were about to take it across the Atlantic. And General Arnold heard about it and stopped them in their tracks, sent a courier out to tell them to turn around and come back. He wasn't going to have a woman flying over the ocean because he thought if they crashed it would be so hard on morale. That was his reasoning. Not that they couldn't do it, but that was as close as we came to getting overseas. We were strictly operating within this country and a little bit over the Canadian border when there were planes going to the Russian account. Some of the pilots would fly across the border into Canada and turn it over to the Russians. But other than that, it was strictly within the United States.
The community's reaction to a female pilot.
Well, I was totally clueless as far as the community's reaction. I'm sure there was a lot of surprise because there just weren't that many women pilots in those days. But I was removed from the community by then, so I don't know. I didn't get any feedback.
Marion's WASP flight training.
Well, I took my flight training in Sweetwater, Texas, way out in the middle of nowhere. 6 long months later, it was 7 of training, the same as the Air Force cadets took. And then I was stationed at Love Field in Dallas in the Ferry Command, where I would pick up new airplanes at factories and deliver the planes to bases all across the country. A lot of them went to Fort Dix, New Jersey, where they would be disassembled and put on ships and sent overseas and put together again over there.
The types of aircraft Marion flew.
I flew single and multi-engine trainers, Air Force trainers. The AT-6 is the one you might be familiar with since they're still in air shows all over the country. That was the fastest single-engine plane I flew. And the twin-engine plane that I liked most was the C-45, which was a twin-engine Beechcraft.
The AT-6 trainer.
Well, it was a wonderful airplane, and the term user-friendly had not been invented yet, but it was user-friendly. And it was the plane, I feel like today I could get on an AT-6 and take off. It's the only plane I feel like that about. Maybe the Twin Beech, too. Those were my 2 favorites. But the AT-6 was powerful, and it had a retractable landing gear, and that's what we loved. And it was just a neat airplane. And you see it all the time in air shows today, so it's still a good plane, and the lines of it are still good. I think it's a beautiful airplane. I don't know anybody that didn't like the AT-6.
Marion's primary military trainer prior to the AT-6.
The primary trainer was an open cockpit Fairchild, 2-place low-wing monoplane. And it was a neat plane too. I wish I had bought one right after the war. They were selling for just nothing. But nobody had any money, so had missed opportunity. But it was really good to do acrobatics in, and it was a neat airplane to fly. And it looked huge to us after flying Cubs. That was what I got my license in. It looked like a big airplane.
Aerobatic training.
We did aerobatics, yes. I don't know if that was legal or whether our instructors just taught us how to do it because on a whim or what, but we did do it. I got pretty good at doing a slow roll in an AT-6. We would go out, we weren't supposed to do it solo, but Shirley, the one on the cover of Life, and I would go out and play around together and show off to each other, see if we could do a slow roll without losing altitude.
Spin training and bailouts.
A classmate of mine, on a spin recovery, I told you the zoot suits, the coveralls that we had to wear that were like the men's were way too long and the sleeves were too wide and had to be rolled up. And on a spin recovery, we were taught in those days to jam the stick forward. And she did, and when she did, the cuff of her zoot suit caught on her safety belt buckle, and so she went right out over the prop. And she still has after effects from that. She was injured, but not terribly, but she never got 100% back, and she didn't get to finish training. But several gals on spin recoveries, nobody knows for sure what happened, but more than one bailed out. I couldn't tell you exactly the number.
The deaths of classmates at the WASP flight school.
right after I got to Sweetwater, this very nice girl who had come to our room and welcomed us to the base and tried to undo the hazing that we had just encountered, was killed a few days later. And then later on in training, 2 of my classmates and their instructor were killed. So we were a little bit nervous, shall we say, because there were rumors that there was structural failure, and there isn't much you can do about that.
The effect of the deaths on the rest of the WASPs.
Just made us more determined than ever that we were going to get through. If there was any feeling out in the general public about stopping the program then, I didn't know it. Because really, the United States was in desperate straits, and they needed pilots, and they needed them badly, and they needed them right away, because all the men were going overseas. So we were put in service immediately to take the pressure off and serve on the stateside jobs that the men would normally be serving.
Parachutes as part of their flight kit.
We always had parachute seat packs. We had to hoist them up behind us when we walked, and they were cumbersome and heavy, but it was necessary for us to wear them.
The WASP's primary duty, ferrying aircraft.
Well, ferrying aircraft meant getting from A to B in the air. We would go to the factories and pick up, like the North American factory outside of Dallas. I would pick up an AT-6 there, and I would be given all these papers to sign, and would be given, well, the first 20 minutes of our flight would be considered sort of a test flight, and if anything was wrong with the airplane, you'd take it back and you would not buy it for the Air Force. And one time I picked up an AT-6 and I was inside the hangar about to start it up with 2 mechanics standing by with fire extinguishers, and the plane caught on fire on the ground. And we had been taught that if the plane caught on fire while we were starting it up, to jam the throttle forward and it would blow the flames out. So I jammed the throttle forward and the flames just got higher. And I'd pull it back and jam it forward, and nothing happened except that the fire was raging. So I decided to get out of that airplane, and so just as I was getting out, one of the mechanics had hopped up on the wing, and he was going to stand there next to the cockpit and work the throttles back and forth while the second mechanic trained his fire extinguisher on the flames. So I retreated to a safe distance and cowered in the corner while they put the fire out, but they did get it out. However, that was one airplane I did not buy for the Air Force. So, but if all had gone well and I had bought it for the Air Force, then I would fly it to the base, say Selma, Alabama, or Fort Dix, New Jersey, or someplace like that where they had orders for me to deliver the airplane.
Ferrying as a group, then solo.
When we first started out in the Ferry Command, we would go with a whole group, and the group would more or less stay together. But after we were broken in, we just went our own way. And I never had a co-pilot even on the C-45, which surprised my husband. He was a Navy pilot, a Marine pilot, but he said all Marine pilots are Navy pilots, Navy trained. But anyway, he couldn't believe that we didn't fly with co-pilots on the C-45. And when I look at them today, the few that are left, I'm impressed with myself. I didn't realize they were so big. So I guess that was pretty good to fly them without a co-pilot.
Ferrying top secret equipment.
I had to ferry the Norden bomb site, which was top secret equipment. And they gave us a 45 to wear. We'd strap that on, and they had given us a class in how to take it apart and put it together, they thought. And nobody showed us how to shoot it. So I don't know what protection that was. But anyway, when I would remain overnight, RON as we called it, I would have to post a guard on the plane all night long, and it would lead to some interesting things like military policemen coming up to me and saying, "Show me your ID." Of course, in those days, we didn't have a uniform. We just wore the same thing the men did. Same shirt and trousers and pinks or tans or greens with a shirt and necktie and the Air Force wings and the insignia on our shoulders. So we looked military, but we weren't. We were civil service. I think they were trying to get us in the military at that point. Anyway, the military police would come up and stop us and say, let us see your ID. And so they were usually very polite, and you'd show them your ID and they'd let you go. This one military policeman came up to me and was very brusque and really rude and wouldn't accept my ID. He said, "Oh yeah, sure, you're a pilot, yeah." And so I remember that 3 WASPs had been locked up overnight in Americus, Georgia for impersonating an officer. And that was what he was trying to get me for, impersonating an officer. Anyway, I had been flying all day when he stopped me. And the weather had been bad, and I was having to avoid thunderstorms, and I was having trouble with my radio. I had to go to the bathroom, and I was hungry and tired, and I had just had enough. And he was so rude that I just drew myself up to my full height, and he came to about here on me, and I said, "Say sir when you speak to me." And he said, "Oh, yes sir," and then he let me go. But that was what the Norden bomb sight got me into.
The special red button.
And they didn't tell us what it was, but they had a little panel up over the instrument panel that said, if forced down over enemy territory, push these 2 buttons. And there were 2 little red buttons, and my fingers just itched to go up there and push those buttons to see what would happen. But somebody said, "Oh, it probably would have just rung a bell back at Love Field." So I think it was a self-destruct thing. They never did tell us what the bomb sight was, but you know, the word gets around. Rumor factory's always working overtime. And the amazing thing I discovered during World War II was that most of the rumors turned out to be true, which was a surprise to me.
Navigating without a navigator.
I have no sense of direction, none at all. And people say, "Well, how would you get from A to B with no sense of direction?" And I'd say, "Because I had a compass." And we just depended on the few instruments that we had. Now, after I got to the Norden bomb site, I could set that thing on the place that I wanted to go, and it would take me straight to it. It acted like an automatic pilot. So it was a snap to navigate with the Norden bomb sight on board.
The B-29 shaming flight and a twist-happy ending.
B-29s in the beginning were getting a terrible reputation because the planes were catching on fire so often, especially on takeoff. And the test pilot at Boeing had been killed in a B-29. So men were refusing to fly it with good cause. And General Arnold got the idea of letting the women fly it to shame the men into it. And so he told Colonel Paul Tibbets, you know, the one who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, to take some gals out and show them how to fly the B-29 and take them around the country and let them give demonstration flights so the men would see that even a woman could handle it. So I think it took 3 days. He took them to a secret place, an airfield in Alabama somewhere, and in 3 days taught these 2 little gals, both of them not much over 5'2" or 3", to fly the B-29. And so they flew to, now let's see if I can remember the place, an airfield in Texas, and put on a demonstration about how easy it was to fly. And years later, it must have been 55 or 60 years later, 55 anyway, the Confederate Air Force had an article about this girl in their magazine. And this fellow that had been at the airfield when she had demonstrated the B-29 wrote her a letter, and he said, "You won't remember me, but you came to," I can't say the name of the field, and demonstrated how easy it was to fly a B-29. And I'm going to admit, after all these years, I was scared of it, and so were a lot of other people. But after you demonstrated how easy it was to fly, we never had another man refuse to fly it. And I just wanted to tell you thank you after all these years. Well, this is a long, convoluted story, but this same man who wrote the letter read my book and wrote me a fan letter about my book. And so somehow we corresponded back and forth. And he told me about Dora, the girl that had flown the B-29 in. And I said, "Well, you know, he was in South Carolina, and I was living in Fort Worth at that time, and Dora lived on the outskirts of Fort Worth in Richland Hills. I don't know if you know where that is." And I said, "She lives not very far from here." And he had decided to come see me. His wife had died, and I guess my husband obviously had died. But he was going to come see me. And I said, "Well, Dora lives close to Fort Worth. Wouldn't you like to see her after all these years? Anyway, he not only went to see her, but they are now married after all those years. They both had had spouses in between who had died, so that had a happy ending.
False alarms in flight.
Lights would turn on, red lights would come on and just scare me to death, and it would turn out to be just a malfunctioning light. Actually, nothing ever went wrong, but I always thought it was going wrong, and I was scared to death half the time. Dry mouth, sweaty palms.
Men's acceptance of female pilots doing a man's job.
At Love Field, where I was stationed, they liked us. Now, I've heard that at some stations the WASPs were resented, especially at Camp Davis, North Carolina. They gave them a really hard time, gave the WASPs a hard time. But they were very positive in their attitude toward us at Love Field. So I really didn't feel any resentment, except one time there were a couple of little twerps that gave me a hard time, and I just, brushed it off. They didn't have time to fool with that kind of thing. But mostly, I think we were admired, actually, because they knew that they needed us. For some of them didn't want to go overseas, and they didn't appreciate us making it possible for them to go overseas when they had a nice job on stateside. But mostly, I would say we were accepted as friends and not as enemies or anybody to be competing with. We cooperated instead of competing. We were not trying to take the men's place. We were just trying to fill in where we were needed during the war, but this was way before the women's movement. And I don't think any of us were feminists, really. I didn't come across any that were. Of course, the word was not even invented then, I don't think.
The prejudice and perks at B-26 Flight Training School.
When the WASP went to B-26 school in Dodge City, Kansas? Dodge City, Kansas, is that where it is? They were told that their group commander, or not group commander, flight leader, had not been told that his new class was women. And so they were all seated around in the ready room waiting for him to show up, and when he opened the door and looked in and saw he had a class full of women, only women, he said, "I'm not going to fly with any GD women," and slammed the door shut and exited. Anyway, Sandy, this one roommate, Shirley and Sandy were the ones that told me this story, was just furious. And she said, "I'll get even with that little pipsqueak if it's the last thing I do." And she did too. They've been married for over 60 years now. She got even with him. Obviously, he came around.
The novelty of a women's airbase.
The field was closed to outside traffic because so many people were curious about the WASP that they were landing there and checking us out. So they closed the field to outside traffic. But all that did was create a lot of emergencies and forced landings at Sweetwater, and that was always fun. Buddy Rogers came in. You wouldn't know him, but he was a movie star that was well liked in those days. And one you might remember was William Holden. They came in and landed, declaring an emergency, of course. That was always fun to see who was in those airplanes that wasn't supposed to be.
Barracks life on the WASP airbase.
The barracks were one board thick, and in West Texas it really gets hot. And whoever built the barracks built them so that they did not catch the prevailing breeze. We did have a wind in West Texas at night, and that would have cooled things off, but the barracks were facing so that you didn't get a breath of air. And so we would have to open the windows when I first got there in March of '43. And we were overlapping cadets that were on the field. They had been training Canadian pilots and then American pilots, and they were getting them out of there to make room for the WASP to come in. Well, the cadets had a barracks right next door to ours, and so when we started to disrobe, we would hear coming in the window, and we had to learn to walk around like Groucho Marx, all crouched over, so they wouldn't whistle. Well, the CO got wind of this, and so he had all the windows painted black. There were no shades on the windows, but we couldn't breathe. We still had to open the window to get a little circulation in the room. And so we had to deal with the wolf calls and whistles while the cadets were there, but in a few weeks they were moved on out. We kind of missed them. It was sort of a challenge.
2 Texas hazards, the heat and the rattlesnakes.
It was so hot that in the summertime that we would take our mop bucket and take it over to the room where there was a Coke machine and some ice, and we'd fill the mop bucket up with ice and wring our nightgowns out in that ice water and put them on, and then pull our cots outside between the barracks and sleep on the cots out there. But, oh, I know a story that you'd be interested in. I was going to say the danger was that a snake might get up in the bed with you. We had lots of rattlesnakes. In fact, one trainee got up in the air several thousand feet and looked out on the wing, and there was a rattlesnake crawling up toward the cockpit. She had the presence of mind to put the plane in a side slip and said he went down like a helicopter, and she couldn't tell where he landed, but she checked the newspapers the next day and nobody had been killed by a rattlesnake bite, so she assumes he landed in the wilds. But you never knew what you were going to encounter in Sweetwater. They have rattlesnake roundups out there now. They didn't have them then.
Speculation regarding the rattlesnake on the wing.
Well, I think the rattlesnake had climbed up into the engine maybe to get warm. Sometimes it got cool in the middle of the night, and just came out after she took off and was trying to find an exit. And so he was on the wing and decided he'd go back toward the cockpit, and that's when they parted company.
The love-hate relationship of WASP cadet training.
Oh, here's this picture of a girl lying on a bench, sound asleep, face down. And that was the way we had to learn how to relax, because we would be in the ready room half of the day, and we would always be exhausted, especially if we'd been night flying the night before. So we had to learn to sleep on these little tiny slat benches, really, in the ready room to catch up on our beauty sleep. So it was tough. It was a really rough training, but we loved it, loved every minute of it. Well, we didn't love the link trainer that we had to practice in. It was hot and claustrophobic. And we didn't love physical training. We called it physical torture. And we hated ground school, but the flying part we loved.
Maintaining femininity in a military environment.
We were women, and we did our nails and our hair. We weren't supposed to wear red nail polish, so we polished our toes red, just to show our defiance. But anyway, we were always women first. In fact, Jacqueline Cochran used to say to us, be women first and pilots second. So I rolled my hair up every night and always wore lipstick. And most of us were feminine. There were a few rough types that I've always wondered about.
Fraternizing with the flight instructors.
Some of the instructors married their students. We weren't supposed to date them, but we did on the QT. Until Jacqueline Cochran got wind of it and really cracked down on us and wouldn't even let us drink a Coke in the ready room with them.
Bravery and a sense of duty to the war effort.
I'm glad to brag on the WASP because I think they were the bravest women I've ever known, and I never felt anywhere up to the level of bravery that they had. But people at Camp Davis, for example, there were rumors that sabotage was downing the planes, and 2 girls were killed, 2 WASPs were killed. And they went right on in the face of that and prejudice and whatever else they were having to deal with, and just could not be deterred from their job of helping defend our country, helping win the war.
Transition from trainers to fighters, a choice to make.
I think I would have automatically stepped up to the fighters if I had not gotten out when I did. You see, in the spring of 1944, there was a surplus of pilots. The training schools were turning out hundreds at a time. Men were coming back from overseas because the war was winding down. And there was a big move underfoot to get rid of the women pilots because we were replacing the men, they said, instead of just releasing them. So at that point, the women in the Ferry Command were stepping up to the fighters, and I would have stepped up to the fighters, I'm assuming, but I resigned since we were being resented and not needed anymore, and to get married. I was madly, wildly in love. So I got out in June of '44, or I probably would have gone on to pursuit school, because I think nearly everybody in the Ferry Command did.
The WASPs as an inspiration to today's female combat pilots.
There's a woman combat pilot out at Shepherd Air Force Base who's a lieutenant colonel named Jill Long, and she's had many combat missions, and I've talked to her about that. It's pretty exciting.
The WASPs and Tuskegee Airmen, similar discrimination experiences.
Several times at air shows we have shared the tent with the Tuskegee Airmen and gotten to talk to them, and they were about the same size we were. I think there were about around 1,000 of them, and there were around 1,000 of us. They were dealing, as you said, with prejudice the same as we were dealing with prejudice. So we had a lot in common, and I have a funny story to tell about the Tuskegee Airmen. I was being ferried back to, when we delivered an airplane, we had to go to the first available airlines back to our base, and if there was no airlines, then the Air Force would furnish a pilot and a plane and fly us to the nearest airlines. So I was being flown to Montgomery, Alabama to get on the first airliner to go back to my base. When we got lost, we were in an AT-6 and I was sitting in the back seat, and I knew from the minute we took off that this pilot was going to get lost. You know, you could just tell. And the stick had been taken out of its slot in the back seat and put over in the side. And there were many times during that flight when I was sorely tempted to grab that stick out and put it back where I could control the plane, but I resisted the temptation. Anyway, it was getting dark, and we were lost, and he went around and, you know, was obviously going in big circles, and he was running out of gas, so he finally decided to put down, and that was at Tuskegee. And the Tuskegee Airmen were just falling out of their airplanes looking at me, and I was falling out of my airplane looking at them because we didn't know each other existed. So anyway, we got gassed up and went on to Montgomery, where he had to make 3 passes at the field before he could get the plane down. Whew, I was glad to get out of that airplane. He had been grounded, I don't know what for, probably from some kind of flight deficiency, and hadn't flown for a long time, but I feel sorry for, well, I feel sorry for him. I didn't feel like he was going to make it through.
Risky business, or maybe risque business.
When the women were ferrying fighters, it got really hot in the summertime in those cockpits, and you're not supposed to open the hatch, but this one a classmate of mine got so hot in her P-51 that she decided she would take off her shirt and catch a few rays and cool off at the same time. So she took off her shirt because she was way up at, I don't know, 10,000 feet, and nobody around her thought she was safe. And she still was hot. And so she thought, well, I'll just crack the hatch just a little bit. And she knew she wasn't supposed to do that because things fly out when you do that. But she wasn't thinking, and she was hot and wanted some relief, so she cracked open the hatch and whoosh, out went the shirt. This happened more than once, believe it or not. Anyway, she thought, well, I've got a clean shirt in my briefcase underneath my feet. Before I land, I can put that on. I'll just stay like this now, at least cool off a little bit. So she was flying along, straight and level, and all of a sudden she had the feeling that somebody was looking at her. And she looked around and looked over her shoulder, and there was another P-51. No, it wasn't a P-51, it was a Navy plane, with the pilot just grinning. She said he was so close that his propeller was almost chewing a hole in her wing, and she said she could count his freckles, he was so close. Anyway, he grinned and smirked and finally peeled off and left her, but she always wondered what kind of stories he took back about naked women pilots.
No limitations. The sky is the limit.
Well, I never really felt that I had any limitations. My family always made me feel like I could do anything I really wanted to if I was willing to work hard and pay the price. So even though there were all these cultural restrictions, I didn't feel them, or I felt like there was a way around them, and I felt we didn't feel feisty about our rights. We were just real glad that the barriers were dropping. And I think the women today, like Jill Long, she feels very beholden to the WASP because she said we were the ones that paved the way for her to be able to do what she wanted to do. But I don't think she encounters very much resentment either. In fact, I think there's almost none these days, because the WASPs, I don't mean the WASPs, the women military pilots of today have proved that they can do everything as well as the men. And I don't really think they're competing. I think they're just all part of the same organization now. Back then it was women pilots and men pilots, and now it's just pilots. Instructors say the women are better pilots than the men because we're gentler and easier on the controls.
A close call.
I had a close call on a TWA airliner when I was trying to get back to my base. We were over New York City on the takeoff, and one engine went out. And you're never supposed to turn toward the dead engine, but the pilot did. You're not supposed to turn back toward the airport when you have trouble on takeoff, but the pilot did. And on board the plane, it was a DC-3, which was what most of the airlines flew in those days. There were 19 men and one other WASP and me, because we had a priority that got us on the airplane and bumped anybody else except the White House. And so everybody screamed, the men were screaming, saying, "Oh my God, don't do that." And it looked like we weren't going to make it, really. And I can remember looking out the window and seeing the high tension wires and wondering if we were going to clear them. He still had his wheels up. And we just barely cleared those wires. And he got the wheels down and hit the ground within seconds. And of course it didn't roll at all. He had milked it for every ounce of airspeed he could get out of it. So it was just blam, and we were down, and that was it. So that was a real close call. And the pilot was really shook up. He was 24 years old and just did a masterful job, even though he broke all the rules. We wouldn't have made it if he hadn't broken the rules. So I guess there's a time and a place to break rules. He did the right ones.
The Life magazine feature article on the WASPs.
Well, they sent Peter Stackpole, who was their #1 photographer, to the field to photograph us in all the aspects of our training. And you never knew when you got in the plane if Peter Stackpole was going to be in the back seat, because he would fly with the girls and get the shots from the air. And he was not satisfied, though. He stayed for several days, and he got all these wonderful pictures, but not any one that he thought was right for the cover of Life, and he was wanting to have the cover shot. And so the day he was going to leave in the airplane that was ferrying him around, my roommate was sitting on the horizontal stabilizer of a BT, which she wasn't supposed to do, but she was doing that anyway. And she had her hair in pigtails, no makeup on, and she was in coveralls, those men's coveralls, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And Peter Stackpole, as he was getting into his plane, looked over and saw her and said, "There's the cover of Life." And he took the picture, and that's what came out.
The coveralls.
Oh, well, the coveralls were made for men, and so we had to wrap the belt around a couple of times. I didn't have any problem with the length because I'm so tall, but most of the girls had to roll up the pant legs and the sleeves to be able to walk around in it, and the crotch would be down around their knees, and it was very difficult to look military under those conditions. So that was what we wore all day, every day, and we were issued 2 pairs, and when one pair would get dirty or dusty or sweaty, we would stand in the shower with the coveralls on with a scrubbing brush and a bar of soap and scrub it down, rinse it off, hang it up on a hanger, and get in the other pair of coveralls while we were waiting for that pair to dry. That's the way we stayed clean.
Marion and Ned.
Well, he was a family friend, and he was 8 years older than I, so there was really no romance going on. He was off flying for Eastern Airlines before I even got to college. And he would come by our house just as a friend and encourage me because he knew I was learning to fly in the CPT program. And I remember he gave me a little tiny pair of wings to put on my lapel to show that I was a pilot. And I thought what a nice guy he was, but he really wasn't tall enough. He was about that much shorter than I was. So I never thought of him as romantic material. But I always liked him. He was a real nice guy, and everybody liked him, just one of those good people. And when I went to work for the War Department, before I went in the WASP, I worked for the War Department at the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago. And Ned, my husband-to-be, was flying some Marine Corps aces around the country on war bond fundraising tours. And he said, hey, there's a little girl from Athens, Georgia up here. I think I'll look her up. So he looked me up and took me out to dinner with a cousin along, so it wasn't even a date, just with the two of us. And but he was very attractive, and I thought, gee, I wish he was taller. But they had windows, not windows, mirrors all around the dance floor where we were dancing at I think it was the Drake Hotel in Chicago, I forget for sure. And I looked in the mirror and saw that I could, I was taller than he was, and it was very obvious, and I thought, this just isn't going to work, and I wish he was taller because I sure do like this guy. Well, he went off and crashed not very long after that and wasn't expected to live. And I wrote to him every day because he was not expected to live, and I wanted to cheer him up. Meanwhile, I had been accepted for the WASP. Well, no, I guess it was after his crash that I was accepted. And I wrote him the news, and every day I wrote him what I was doing and what planes I was flying after I got into training, trying to cheer him up and keep his morale up. And a year and a half later, they released him from the hospital, and he came and got me. And I decided, well, he's too short, but that's the only size he comes in, and I want him. So we were married for 53 years.
Ned's flying background.
He was trained first as the Navy pilot, then he flew for the airlines, then Pearl Harbor came along and they called him back into the Marine Corps as a pilot.
Ned's near-fatal crash.
It was at Cherry Point, North Carolina. He was organizing the first night fighter squadron to go overseas in the Pacific, and he was simulating the conditions they were going to have to land and take off in the North Pacific without landing lights and runway lights and so on. And the tower didn't, it was really the tower's fault. He thought all the time it was pilot error because that's what they told him. But just recently I met a man who, well, I already knew him, but I talked to a man who witnessed the crash, and he said it was not Ned's fault, that he had been cleared to land and a bomber, an Army bomber, was crossing the runway right after he had been cleared to land, and he plowed into the bomber. Fortunately, it didn't hurt anybody on the bomber, but it nearly killed him, as you can tell from the picture, and the man who was sandbagging in his back seat got burned on one leg. But the tower, they dropped the ball. But they wrote the report up as if it was pilot error, and he went to his grave thinking it was, and it wasn't until I saw this man after Ned had died that said, no, it was not his fault. He said they always said pilot error just to cover themselves.
The WASP Museum at the old air base in Sweetwater, Texas.
The hangar is still there, and they have a museum in that hangar, a very good WASP museum with lots of artifacts, and they have recreated one of the bays, one of the rooms in the barracks, pretty faithfully, with the cots that we had to sleep on and were so uncomfortable, and the little tiny locker that we had to get all of our belongings in. I don't know how a bunch of women ever did that.
The WASP getting military recognition as military veteran. Finally.
We had been ignored in the history books, and most people didn't even know about us and still don't. And what was it that, they had the Pentagon released a story that the Navy was going to train its first military women pilots. And I guess it was the Navy, anyway, one of the services, but the story came out of the Pentagon that they were going to train the first women military pilots. Well, that finally got our goat because we were the first, and it had been, way back in the 40s, so 30-something years. And so we rose up in a body and screamed and pounded our fists. But we went before Congress, a representative group of us, aided by, I think it was Barry Goldwater. I think he was still alive then. And Congress belatedly recognized us as having served in the military and gave us full veterans' rights, which I don't know, we were too late for the GI Bill, but I guess if we fell on hard times, we could go to the Veterans Hospital. And we can have a flag on our coffin. During the war, if a family lost a WASP, they couldn't put a flag on the coffin, they couldn't put a gold star in the window, and there was no insurance. And people say, well, wasn't that terribly unfair? You know, didn't you feel discriminated against? But how could we feel discriminated against when we were given the most wonderful opportunity that women had ever had? No woman had ever flown military planes before, and here they were going to trust us with these big, wonderful airplanes. And the WASPs, even though I didn't fly the bombers and the fighters, WASP did fly every single bomber and every single fighter in the Air Force arsenal, including the B-29.
Retired from flying.
Never flew again. You know, I had a very exciting, interesting life, and I loved raising my 3 children, and I was just busy doing other things. I was there when they needed me, and they didn't need me anymore, so that part of my life was over. But I would still, if I was hanging up clothes on the line, this was before dryers came in, if a plane flew overhead, I would still follow it with my eyes, and sometimes I'd wish I was up there.
Mary writes an autobiography of her WASP experiences, Winning My Wings.
Well, I started writing the book when I first got out, while it was still very fresh in my mind. Thank goodness I did, because the flying episodes, the cockpit checks and things like that, I probably wouldn't be able to remember accurately, but I knew everything by heart by then. I was a short story writer. This was back in the days when magazines published short stories and paid very well for them. I think the least I ever got was $1,000 for a short story, and back then that was really good money. But anyway, I had tried to make a short story out of my WASP experience, tried it several different ways. I tried it as articles. I tried it in every form I could think of, and nobody was buying because everybody was sick of World War II. And they didn't want to talk about it, they didn't want to think about it, they didn't want to read about it, they wanted to get back to normal. So it was very frustrating to have this story that you were dying to tell and nobody wanted to hear it. So really, I would put it away, and once in a while when I wouldn't have something else I was working on, I'd get it out and add a little bit to it, or try a different form, or just would keep all the material together. So this went on for nearly 50 years before finally the climate was right for a World War II book, and then it was easy to get it published. It is a history book as well as a love story. It's a red-hot love story, too. We were married for 53 years, so it lasted.
Marion Hodgson passed away on March 16, 2016 at the age of 94. Her honest and humble story lives on at Air Combat Journal. If you enjoyed this show and would like to see more like it, please subscribe to this channel. Subscribing will encourage me to get more of my 200 interviews out, as well as will improve my YouTube analytics. As always, thank you for watching, and I welcome your comments.